City Council Committee, the Committee of the Whole, met in council chambers on September 6, 2023, at 6 p.m. for the purpose of discussing the matters listed below. This notice of the meeting was posted on August 25th, 2023, at 10:59 a.m. Absent currently is Councilor McLean. Thank you. I'm writing it down as I'm trying to think of it. Everyone else is here. With us tonight, we also have various members of various city departments, the Mayor Pangallo, City Solicitor, Elizabeth Renard, City Finance Director, and Daniel from the Planning Department. Tom Daniels, our Planning Director. We're all here. Stephen Cortez is here. Look at that. It's a full house tonight. We're all here. I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank members of the Crowley team for being here as well. We're going to take, the first matter we're going to take up this evening is matter number 409. City of Salem and City Council, this was brought in August 24, 23, resolution to authorize a tax increment finance agreement with Crowley Wind Services, whereas Crowley Wind Terminal LLC herein Crowley wishes to redevelop the property at 67 Derby Street, Salem, Mass, and herein after the property known as the assessor parcel 41-0339-0, and whereas Crowley intends to redevelop the site for the use as an offshore wind marshalling station to collect and store wind turbine components prior to loading them onto turbine installation vessels herein after the project, and whereas upon completion the project will support and realization of regional, state, and federal renewable energy goals and will provide new employment opportunities for the greater Salem community, and whereas the City of Salem hereafter the city is willing to grant tax concessions in return for the guarantee of the revitalization of the project, now therefore be it resolved that the City of Salem City Council hereby endorses the use of the tax increment financing as a tool to encourage economic development on the property and provides for a tax exemption on the property for the period of 20 years beginning in the first fiscal tax year after certificate of occupancy is issued, and for the project in accordance with the schedule listed below. Said exemption is being in accordance with Mass General Law, Chapter 23A, Section 3E, and Chapter 40, Section 59. Be it further resolved that the mayor is hereby authorized on behalf of the city to enter into a tax increment finance agreement, a copy of which is attached hereto with Crowley. Be it further resolved that the City of Salem is hereby authorized to submit the application to the Economic Assistance Coordinating Council, the EACC, for approval of the tax increment finance agreement. And it's dated August 24th, and it's attested by Eileen Simons, the city clerk. All that being said, what we're here tonight is the mayor and his staff has worked with Crowley and their people and has come up with a tax increment proposal that is in front of us, and we are here to approve it and send it to the full council for a yes or no. At this point, all the parameters of the agreement have been worked out with the entities involved, and we are here to hear how they got to that conclusion. And after tonight, we'll move that the matter be referred to the city council at some point, and at that point, the city council will then authorize the mayor to enter into that agreement. The mayor and his staff and his legal team have worked diligently. I can speak for them because I was working them for a while myself with coming up with an agreement that will work for everybody. And so with that, I would just like to reiterate that we are here to listen to how this agreement came to fruition. And in the end, because the agreement has already been agreed to in principle between the mayor and Crowley, we are here to authorize the mayor to enter into that agreement. We're not here to amend it, change the terms. Those have already been agreed upon by both legal teams, and so we're here to approve to make sure that we're going to authorize them into that agreement. So all that being said, I will then open up the floor to Mayor Pangallo for some remarks, and then I'm assuming he was going to want to turn it over to Tom and his team. So with that, Mayor Pangallo.
Thanks very much, Councilor. So I do want to recognize Tom, Kate, Anna, Stephen, and the city staff who did work on this to get to this point. It fell over 2 changes of administration, so it was no small task. But I also want to thank Crowley and the Mass CEC team for their partnership in this project. There's some folks from Crowley who are here tonight in the process of negotiating the required agreements for this to be before you. And lastly, I want to thank you, Councilor McCarthy, who provided some critical foundation for this process over the first several months of this year. So as you mentioned, Tom will have a presentation on the TIF agreement in a moment, but I wanted to share some important points about how we got here and what this agreement represents. I think at this point we're all pretty familiar with the project that's under discussion here, the Salem Offshore Wind Terminal, which represents a transformational opportunity for our tax base, a chance to create clean energy jobs, and to advance an industry that will help us as a Commonwealth and as a country meet our climate and energy independence goals. And what's more, it's aligned with our harbor plan and our shared aspirations for a more diverse economy, an active waterfront, and meaningful progress to meet our climate goals. When completed, the Salem Offshore Wind Terminal is projected to make up to 6.1 gigawatts of offshore electricity generation possible initially. That's almost 2/3 of the Commonwealth's 2035 goal and 1/5 of the nation's 2030 goal. It's enough clean energy to power 3.5 million homes and businesses, with an estimated carbon emissions reduction equal to removing 2.3 million vehicles from our roadways. The throughput potential longer term, including the capacity to serve floating offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine, is even greater. This is a textbook public-private initiative. $33.8 million in federal funds have been secured to date, and another $20 million are being pursued. $75 million has flowed in from the state to the project, and Crowley will invest their own funds as well. The TIF proposal that's before you is effectively the mechanism by which we, the city, can now also do our part to help subsidize the success of this critical project. Federal, state, local, and private sector working together. Over the 20 years of the TIF, 42% of the total taxes due, not including the base value of the property pre-construction, will be abated, with 97% of that abatement falling in the first 15 years of the agreement. To put that 42% amount into context, when we began negotiations with Crowley, the request for was closer to 90% of the taxes to be abated. In the first year of the agreement, the city is projected to collect around $1.2 million in taxes from this. One of your colleagues helpfully suggested that I put that number into the context of our budget. So for comparison, last year, certified new growth citywide was $1.8 million. In other words, in year one, the taxes generated from the site will nearly equal the entire new growth from across all of Salem last year. For more comparison, our current Chapter 90 allocation from the state for road paving this fiscal year is $834,000. $1.2 million is equal to the amount of local meals excise generated by every restaurant business in Salem in a year. It's equal to the budget of the new Liberty High School, equal to the cost of 2 new fire engines, equal to the next phase of the Palmer Cove Park project, equal to the budget of the Salem Public Library, the Harbor Master's budget, 3 times over, the Sustainability Department's budget, 4 times over, equal to 22 entry-level firefighters or 23 entry-level teachers. In year 16, when almost all of the exemption is ended, the tax abatement is based on the current tax rate, a projected $6 million a year. Year 21, when the exemption is entirely ended, the tax payment is $6.3 million per year. Over the life of the agreement, the city will collect approximately $73 million in new taxes. That growth of our commercial tax base lessens the need for us to raise taxes on homeowners and other businesses, spreading the tax burden out through the community. In negotiating the agreement, one of the benchmarks we set and were mindful of was how the tax revenues collected by the city from this site and the power plant site combined compares to the property taxes collected from the old coal plant, which occupied both parcels. The annual average collected from the old plant in its last decade of active operation was $5.4 million, and at its modern peak, it provided $8.7 million in a year. In year one of this proposed agreement, that same acreage will generate a total of $7.1 million, and by year 6, it will surpass that $8.7 million peak. That means from year 6 onward, all of the property taxes we collect from the site that had once been this coal power plant will be the most we have ever generated from it. This record level of commercial tax expansion is further strengthened by the job potential that this project is bringing to our community. An estimated 150 to 200 jobs will be created through the operation of the terminal, not including jobs and business growth in local sectors that are ancillary to the offshore wind industry itself. In the TIF, we successfully included language that reinforces commitments being negotiated separately by labor in the project labor agreement and that already exists in obligations to the state, prioritizing these jobs for workers from environmental justice communities and other historically marginalized populations. It's critical to us, both from a policy standpoint and a value standpoint, that the economic and job benefits of both this site and the turbine facilities out in the ocean made possible by this site accrue to communities who have been disproportionately harmed by our fossil fuel legacy and the ensuing climate crisis we're now in. We face a unique opportunity to transform this site from one where coal was once piled and burned to a vital facility for a clean energy future. This summer, our planet experienced the hottest day, the hottest June, and the hottest July ever. Warming and rising oceans, raging wildfires, and torrential storms battered our planet, our continent, and our Commonwealth. This project alone won't halt this or reverse it. But without this project and many others like it, no progress will be possible. This is our small part to play for large change. Tom?
If I could,
Yeah.
one quick second, with all my paperwork up here, I feel like I'm obligated to read the meeting notice that actually recognizes SATV, which I
Okay.
didn't do it initially. It's up there, everyone's aware, but I just want to make sure I cover myself. So if I could just take a quick second. Meeting notice, the City Council Committee of the Whole will meet in person on Wednesday, September 6, 2023 at 6 p.m. for the purpose of discussing a resolution to authorize a tax agreement, a TIF agreement with Crowley Wind Services in order for the City of Salem to facilitate the construction and operate of an offshore wind marshalling port at 67 Derby Street. With Crowley Wind Services and the Massachusetts Clean Energy Council, this meeting will be held in City Council chambers at 93 Washington Street, Salem, Mass. Second floor. In person shall be the primary method of public access to such meetings. A secondary method is access may be provided technology feasible through Salem Access Television and remotely through Zoom. And see below the information and access for SATV information. There's also a Zoom link that's on the website, and the password is 588888881, or telephone using 888-475-4499, which is toll-free. Persons requiring auxiliary aids and services for the effective communication of such sign language interpreter or assisted listening devices or print material in digital format and/or reasonable modifications, program services, policy or activities may conduct them in the City of Salem ADA Coordinator at 978-619-5630 as soon as possible and no less than 2 business days before the meeting. The agenda is the resolution to authorize a tax increment finance, a TIF agreement with Crowley Wind Services, and in order for the City of Salem to facilitate the construction and operation of the offshore wind marshalling port with Crowley Wind Services and Mass Shore Clean Energy Council. I'm sorry I missed that initially. I just want to make sure that was in the record. And for the record, City Clerk has also provided me copies of the backup documentation, which is the TIF, if anyone so would like one. I apologize for that.
Sorry. It's the Micro Machine Man.
I
That
have
was
them right
good.
here if anyone wants one. With that, Tom, if you would, please, sir, thank you.
Thank you, sure. Let me share the screen here. All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Mayor, for that great introduction. I am going to just talk a little bit big picture and then get into the TIF specifically. So, right. There we go. So just putting this into the broad context that the Mayor referenced. So, you know, at the city level, we're playing a part in a much larger goal here for the planet. So, firstly, the national level goal from the Biden administration is looking at 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. At the state level, we've got 10 gigawatt. And locally, we've got our climate action plan, Resilient Together. And you know, we have goals in that is looking at, you know, clean energy used by the city and the broader community as a whole. I do want to just say that, you know, 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago now, the idea of Salem playing an active role in offshore wind was really a pipe dream. It was really the Biden administration's declaration and setting this goal that made it viable much sooner than had been anticipated. So the key partners here are us, the city, Crowley, and the Massachusetts Clean Energy Commission, or Mass CEC. The project's going to result in the second offshore wind marshaling port in Massachusetts. So it'll be complementing New Bedford. And the installations that happen here will be servicing areas, could service areas from Virginia to Maine. And while the current installations are looking at being south of Martha's Vineyard, there's a really unique role for Salem in future leased areas in the Gulf of Maine, where we have an ideal location. So again, big picture, in the public sector, we've got every level of government, from the federal government, which is a regulator and also a funding partner through grant funds, the Commonwealth, also a regulator, funding partner, and property owner. The city, we have our own local regulations, financing through this TIF, and then property owner in the near term. And the Port Authority is an important entity as well, looking at port operations and oversight, and are envisioned to be the property owner over long term. I'll get into that later on. Our private sector partner here is Crowley, and I want to acknowledge Eric Evans and Joe St. Pierre, who are here from Crowley, and the broader Crowley team that we've been working with now for 2 years. So they are going to be developing the port and operating it. And then they lease it to folks that are the actual offshore wind developers, folks like Avangrid and Ørsted. So these are the tenants that will be using the port that Crowley is going to be managing and operating. Big picture goals, and the mayor has touched on these. First, again, clean energy production that's advancing goals for the betterment of the planet. World-class marshaling port facility on the East Coast. This third point is we'll get into in the second portion of the presentation later, but I want to pause here. This is a really key outcome from this, in that the city will be getting ownership of the berth and 5 acres and the improvements thereupon. This goes back to the community benefits agreement that Mayor Driscoll had negotiated with Footprint in 2014. And so through this project, we are able to effectuate that right that we've had to end up in ownership of the berth and the 5 acres. And that berth is the most valuable part of this project. We'll still be able to have up to 6 large cruise vessels there. And then there's actually an opportunity for revenue that will support port operations. Another goal that the mayor talked about was the tax base increase and the jobs. And so reiterating again the values commitment around jobs, looking to hire locally and from EJ populations and other demographics that have been often overlooked. Economic diversification. So going back a couple years ago, we were in the midst of the pandemic, and being an economy with a significant tourism base, we were really hit. We fared super well, better than I think anyone had expected. But, we've always had an objective of looking to diversify our economic base, because that in and of itself is being resilient to changes in the market. So I can't think of, an opportunity where an industry shows up almost overnight. And then there's be a community benefits agreement that addresses other city goals. So shifting to the TIF, and just a couple slides on what a TIF is to remind people about the tool that the city has used many times before. This is a way for the local municipality to support private investment by exempting a portion of property taxes on a site. The TIFs are negotiated locally, but this is a program of the state, and so the state must approve them. And the entity that approves them is called the Economic Assistance Coordinating Council. And as was stated, TIFs go into effect the first day of July following the completion and the determination of the full assessed value. And assessed values are as of January 1st. So this graphic I'll pause on for just a minute to again talk through how TIFs work. So number one there, the light blue at the bottom, that's the base value. So in a TIF, the base value is always paid. That's a given. There's no exemption on that value. What you see in number two is baseline growth. So although what we're establishing as the base here is $30 million, and I can talk about that in a minute, the assessor will, over time, look at adjusting that, seeing, what is happening with commercial industrial properties broadly in the city. If they're increasing a certain percentage, that base number will increase. And then there's also growth because most likely tax rates will go up over time. Number three, the green vertical rectangle is new value. So that's what's coming from the investment that Crowley is making here. So we're talking about that as being $220 million in new value. So the base of 30 plus the 220 in new value is $250 million. The agreement is looking to exempt a percentage of the property taxes on that new value over the 20 years. At the end of the 20 years, the full assessed value is used and property taxes are paid on the full value. As the mayor mentioned, this is a 20-year TIF, but about 97% of the exemption is in the first 15 years. And I just wanted to note that, I wanted to thank Kate Newhall-Smith here, as well as Daniel Collins. Kate's been working with me on the TIF for many months now, so thank you, Kate, for all your work. And Daniel's new to the team and has been jumping right in as well. So Kate's been in contact with our colleagues at the Mass Office of Business Development, who administer the TIF program, and have been teeing things up for consideration of this on the 21st. So just to pause for a moment on what the property has been generating in terms of taxes recently. So in about a year ago, almost exactly, Crowley purchased the property for $30 million. So that's being reflected in the current year assessed value. So you see, whereas in fiscal 22, we had a $3.6 million value, that went up to 9.3, and then it's going up to 25. What the assessor is saying that the base value in 25 and what will be used in the TIF is $30 million, which reflects the actual acquisition price that was paid. The taxes in the right-hand column, the future taxes are based on last year's tax rate. So those numbers in actuality may be a little different. Now, in terms of the agreement itself and the key terms of that, as we've mentioned, it's a 20-year term. And there's a de-escalating exemption schedule. So for the first 5 years, and this is very common in our TIF agreements, the early years that the TIF have the largest exemption. So that's a 92.5% exemption for the first 5 years. The next 5 years, that goes down to 65%. Years 11 through 15 are at 30%. And as I mentioned, the last 5 years are at 5%. So over the term, about 58% of the taxes, or $73 million, are paid, and 42%, or $53 million, are exempted. We also, in developing this with Crowley, we talked about having a formal check-in. I mean, obviously, Crowley's going to be here, and we can talk to them anytime we want to. But in terms of the agreement, we talked about having a formal check-in in years 9 and 14, and just memorializing that in the agreement so that it happens, and where we sit down and talk about how the port is performing, and does this schedule still make sense? If there were to be any changes, that would require approval by a future mayor, city council, as well as by the EACC. So these commitments for year 9 and 14 are to have conversations, engage intentionally around what's going on here, but any future changes would require approvals locally and at the state. So the city's obligations here are to adhere to the schedule that I just walked through with you. And, again, we've committed to those conversations in years 9 and 14. Crowley's obligations are to invest between $250 and $290 million. in developing the port. They are responsible for maintaining the port, and they are creating jobs. I'm going to pause on here. So it says that there's just 8 direct full-time jobs, and these are Crowley employees. So in the TIF program, again, this is a state program, Crowley needs to provide annual reporting to the state about the jobs that they themselves have created. At this point in time, they know that they will be creating 8 jobs. We're talking about 150 to 200 jobs, though, resulting from the project. As of today, Crowley isn't certain how many of those 150 to 200 jobs will be Crowley employees. They could be other businesses. So the analogy I've been using is similar to a wedding hall reception, where Crowley has the hall. They've got florists, they've got musicians, bartenders, caterers, linen providers. They even have someone who can marry you, but no obligation. And so Avangrid is someone who may decide that they want to use someone other than Crowley for some of those services. So that's why the commitment is to 8 direct jobs, because that's what they need to report on. But the impact to the community will be the 150, 200 jobs. It just may be different entities that those employees may be employees of different organizations. Again, the commitment that I referenced earlier about hiring from demographics that have traditionally been overlooked, and then their obligation in years 9 and 14 to meet with us. So the next steps here are the council meeting on the 14th, where the committee of the whole's recommendation will be considered. If it's approved, Kate will be working with the clerk and the mayor to get that required information to the state so that they're able to discuss it at their meeting the following Thursday on the 21st. And I'm happy to take questions. And I wanted to also acknowledge, I'm sorry, Anna, our finance director, who's been on this TIF journey with us as well. So.
Anyone have a question? Council Dominguez.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Tom, for great information. This is not the first time you addressed the City Council on this important project, and I think it's a great explanation, very clear. However, one question that comes in mind that I hear so many is at what point are we going to have more public input into the project? We haven't seen any public hearings in regard to, because I hear a lot of questions out there. I know you're informing us as a city councilor, but the general public continue to have questions. There is any point in this process where we're going to have public hearings so the general public be informed in these details and any other detail or any question they might have?
Yep, thank you, Councilor. So the project is before the Planning Board and the Conservation Commission. So those boards are conducting public hearings as they're reviewing the project under their jurisdiction. So there's opportunities at both of those boards for members of the public to weigh in. Particularly on the planning board, where there are impacts, potential impacts in terms of noise or dust. Those are standard things that the planning board addresses, and so I encourage community members who want to participate to attend those meetings.
Right. Thank you.
Councilor Harper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Tom, thank you for this information, and just thank you for your responsiveness to any councilors who've had questions around this. We had an email exchange recently, so I just wanted to, highlight a couple items here, and just for the folks at home, if they had any questions around these 2 items. The first one was the base rate escalation, or the assessed value on the base rate, and how that works from year 1 to year 20. And the second one is the lease versus the TIF length. The lease length is 25 years, the TIF is 20 years. So if you could speak on those 2 topics.
Sure, happy to do, Councilor. So the base value, as I said, is being established at $30 million, but the assessor looks at what's happening in the market in terms of commercial industrial property values. And to the extent that they're increasing over time, that base is adjusted up, so that the exemption is truly on that incremental value. That base, if nothing were done, chances are the value is going to increase over time. And so that increase that would be happening anyway because of market conditions, the assessor captures that in updating the base value over the 20-year time. The second question was about the term of the TIF and the term of the lease. So TIFs, the maximum by statute, maximum term of a TIF is 20 years. So that's what this one is. The lease that Crowley is entering into with Mass CEC is for 25 years. And, they're not related from a legal or financial perspective. They're two separate agreements. The lease clearly is Crowley and Mass CEC, and ours is the TIF agreement for the 20-year term.
Thank you.
Council Watson Fell.
Thank you, Chair McCarthy. Mr. Daniel, can you explain for the public's awareness a little bit more about why, if the purchase of the property assessed went from 3.5 to 30 million, right, the cost of the purchase of the land, why Crowley's not paying the taxes on that full assessed value as of the start of 2023 between now and 2025? There's a table in our materials that expresses that there's also step increases over the next whatever that is, 3 years, 2.5 years. Could you just make sure that we all, and everyone listening at home, is really clear on why those steps are in place?
Sure, I'll take a pass, but I do look to our assessor to clarify. So, the value was updated with the purchase. So the purchase was September of 22 or fiscal 23. So the value was already established as of January 23. Now, as we're looking to fiscal 24, the value's been adjusted up to $25 million, which isn't the full 30, but it's moving towards there. And then for the subsequent fiscal year, that full $30 million value will be on the property.
I think the question on the table is why not the full 30 in 2024?
So I would defer to the assessor on that.
Sorry, before you answer, Steve, could we take the presentation down so that the folks at home can see us all, please? Thanks, Tom.
Hi. So the sale occurred in 2022, and so that would be for fiscal year 24. And the DOR requires us to use market, and the sale was for the market. We need to be within 10% or around there for the sale time frame. So that's where we were at 25. Next year, we will look at the market and see if it increases, and then we will, or decrease, whatever it is, and we follow the market, we reflect the market. So because of the DOR standards of where we need to be, most of our sales are all in line with whether it's a single family, commercial, residential, anything, they all have to be within the same margin of percentage. So if commercial is at 0.95%, residential has to be within the same amount of boundaries as well. So it's just in line with the other standard properties classes.
Thank you.
You still have the floor. I was looking to see if anyone else had anything.
Sorry, well, Councilor Dominguez did raise his hand, but I'm going to keep going.
I can't see behind my head. It's okay.
It's all right, thanks. I'd love to better understand also this question around the additional 150 to 200 jobs. I know we talked a little bit about this ourselves in our separate meeting, but for the public's awareness, so you had said that Crowley has to report on the number of jobs that they're going to create, which is 8, absolutely promised to the state and to all of us. But then above that, there is this opportunity for upwards to 150 to 200 jobs. Do they have to report on those as well once they know what that looks like?
So they don't need to report to the state on that. That's why the state's very clear when we're working with businesses on the TIF to be conservative in the jobs that a business is going to be generating, because if they fail to meet those targets, the state can claw back the agreement. So for the purposes of the state TIF agreement, there's no additional reporting required above the 8.
Okay, so not to sound cynical,
Yeah.
but to be really transparent, it sounds like there's potential for a huge labor market push here, right? Which is wonderful, create jobs. I'm very for all of this. But beyond the 8, there's absolutely no promise to our immediate community as to what those numbers look like.
Well, I think Crowley has committed to the 150 to 200 jobs. That's in the agreement. It's just that they can't say that those are going to be Crowley Wind Services jobs. And so,
And so I guess-
in terms of the operation of the port, for it to function, that's what's necessary. Those jobs, several of us had the opportunity to go to New Bedford yesterday to look at the Marine Commerce Terminal and their operations, and they are, they have 150 people working on the site. And this is a comparable, operation.
And they meet all of our expected labor standards and union standards and all of that.
So I can't comment on the New Bedfords. I know they have a PLA, but I don't know all the details of what they have. But that's, similarly here, there will be a project labor agreement. The city is not party to that, but clearly, I think there's an alignment in the values that we have. Crowley is on board with that, and obviously the state, cares about this as well. And in talking with some representatives from some unions, there seems to be alignment there as well.
Okay, that's a helpful answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
I like all the gentlemen behind all nodding their heads when you said that. Councilor Missoula.
Thank you, Chair. So before, when we've seen TIF agreements in the council, it's been more of a gradual. Each year, they add a little bit more to what they're paying. This is more of a step agreement, 5 years at the same level. Doesn't really benefit the city as much as a gradual increase. Can you talk about why you went with this 5-year step approach?
Sure. Yeah. So I think there's been different approaches to TIFs over time. It's not uncommon to have several years at one rate. If we have a 10-year TIF where it's maybe 100% for the first 3 years, and then it drops. So we have done the chunks before. This is not new. And it's to some extent it's the objective that we were bringing was trying to have the TIF front loaded, which is consistent, where the exemption is higher in the front. That's typically when the need is greatest, and bring it down as quickly as we can. The 5 years is. I think there's sort of an efficiency, a simplicity to it. It's not a science to it, but it's looking at how do we make the numbers work, and so that was the approach.
Councilor.
Thank you, Chair McCarthy. I just had a question to follow up on Councilor Watson-Felt's point about, and the points you made about the goals for labor and fair labor practices. I was wondering if any of the commitments will be referenced in the community benefits agreement.
So that has the potential. It's in the TIF agreement. So with the objectives to hire from the populations that we've talked about, more specific hiring goals and things, that's going to wind up in the project labor agreement, what those are, which we're not party to. But I think that, again, there's an alignment of values. Perhaps there's something in the CBA that's reflective of it as well. but the rubber meets the road in the PLA. So I think we're influencers, but we're not the party.
Okay, so it falls in the project labor agreement. Okay, thank you, appreciate that.
Any other questions, Council Merkel? You all set? Council Dominguez?
Thank you, Chair McCarthy. One of the questions that I hear in the general public is, what is the rate on the equipment lease between Crowley and the city of Salem? Can you disclose any information in that regard?
I'm sorry, what is I didn't...
What is the rate on the lease? What is the term? Or disclose any information in regard to that so the public knows exactly what is the equipment based on?
So we'll be talking about the real estate in the next section, but I can touch on that now. So, you know, the city will be leasing our berth and 5 acres to the project. Ultimately, Crowley will be the operator of it. So that's our lease with Mass CEC that then gets passed on to Crowley is for 99 years for $1 a year, which is not uncommon. It's kind of standard practice when there's a public to public or public involvement in a project like this. So, for instance, in New Bedford yesterday, the Marine Commerce Terminal and the operation, while some of the land is owned by Mass CEC, some of the land they lease from the New Bedford Redevelopment Authority, and that's also a 99-year term. But we can talk more about that in the next section.
Councilor Prosniski?
Thank you, Chair McCarthy. Tom, you talked about the Massachusetts Office of Business Development and through its Economic Assistance Coordinating Council. That's the entity that's charged with reviewing the TIF proposal once it's passed. Exactly what parameters do they use to approve or disapprove a TIF agreement? What are they looking at? Are they looking at the jobs? Are they looking at the community benefits? Are they looking at what Crowley is going to be doing with the property? I'm not quite sure what their responsibility is as a government unit to be able to approve or we approve.
Sure. So it's just to go down the rabbit hole a little bit here. There's a couple different types of TIFs. What we're doing is a local-only TIF. So, you know, in contrast, Tropical Products was a TIF where the city was participating. The state was also providing tax credits into the project. So in that situation, the EACC is looking at jobs, and they're looking at, you know, the overall package, and they are awarding, it's competitive, so they are awarding tax credits based on the project, but also as it compares to other projects that are in queue for consideration. This is a different situation because it's local only. The state is participating in this project already. So they're not participating in through the EACC. So there's great deference to the city, to the municipalities when it is a local option. So basically what EACC is doing and the staff, they're wanting to confirm and make sure that the legal language is statutorily compliant, but that's the extent really of what they're looking at.
And that process takes how long?
So we've been communicating with them for many months. Their council has been reviewing the agreement for the past 4 weeks. It's largely there. We're waiting for the final okay from their council. But the business terms are agreed. Like that's what the city is agreeing to with Crowley. And EACC and MOBD, they don't get involved with those terms. Even with a more conventional TIF that we've done, like with Tropical Products, the state isn't getting into what the city agrees to in terms of the schedule of exemption. So.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Councilor Watson-Vaught?
Thank you, Chair McCarthy. One more before we move on to the real estate portion of your presentation. I'm fascinated by this sort of agreement to revisit in years 9 and 14. I love it on its face. Actually, down on the ground logistically, like, how does that work? So say, for example, we follow through this, the logic is they are, Crowley's having a banner few years, everybody's making lucrative wind energy money, and it's all good. And we decide we want to reassess in year 9 or year 14. What if Crowley just says no? Right? Like, what is within the city's ability or rights to kind of ensure Salem is taken care of? Right now, it feels a little bit, and forgive the old-fashioned language here, but like a gentleman's agreement. And I just would like to understand, like, really at its core, how do we protect Salem in that situation? And, and vice versa, if things are going very poorly and they're asking for additional rebate, what does that look like? How are we protecting us?
Yeah, so I think, to be straight up, there's nothing binding. And so it's really a commitment to meet in years 9 and 14. This is a new industry emerging. Just about every time I read about it, particularly recently, you hear about challenges that the industry is facing. And so while I think we're all optimistic about a successful operation, and Crowley, obviously is committed to the project, there's a question. And so I think what we're committing to here is having that conversation, understanding that, Crowley can't bind the city to agreeing to a change in the future, nor can we bind them to changing in the future. But we can agree we're memorializing intentionality here around having those conversations and seeing what comes from there. But in years 9 and 14, after those conversations, if Crowley's saying, hey, we want to amend and increase the exemption, or city says, hey, you're rocking and we want to change it in our favor, there's nothing that binds us, but we have those conversations. And I think it's, there's an opportunity for both Crowley and the city to know that there's a conversation.
And I appreciate that. I think that's fair and good on its face, and I think it's just, I think the city of Salem would probably love it with just a little bit more assurance that if there's an ability to shorten the term or increase the funds coming in, obviously that's where we want to be, especially in a 20-year TIF, which is a little bit longer than the ones we've entertained prior. It does remind me of, when the trash contract came to us and said, look, we know we're mid-contract, but we need an elevator because the economy is terrible, and the city of Salem said no. It's not out of the realm of possibility that Crowley just says no, right? And so making sure that we're all really clear about that and that the public understands that as well. That having been said, I really appreciate, Crowley's ability and willingness to say, yeah, I think revisiting is a fair and just thing. And I hope it works out for everybody in the long run. Thanks.
Who's that, Council? Councilor Cohen.
Thank you, Chair McCarthy. Just to clarify a couple of things, specifically to Councilor Dominguez's first question on the liaison from the council to the Conservation Commission, and they had, I believe, 7 or 8 meetings that were incredibly long and detailed. They started when the project was at the 30% of the plan, and then 60%, and then 90%. There was also a really big, robust meeting at the Salem Academy in the gym. There was 50 people approximately in the gym, and there was about another 70 people online. And I do want to address something that Councilor Merkel asked. At that meeting, I specifically asked Crowley if they were going to mirror the PLA that the New Bedford facility agreed to, the PLA, with the South Shore Labor Council, which was really very innovative. And so I'm very refreshed to see that Crowley and our friends from Labor are sitting so close to each other, and I expect that they'll be sitting next to each other quite a bit, and that the PLA will be something that hopefully all our friends in labor will be very proud of. Thank you.
Councilor Happer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Back to Councilor Wassenfeld's question around the agreement to renegotiate. I don't think it's unusual for agreements between two large entities to have some good faith language in there, because there's a lot of unknowables out there. I see that for sure in my own job. What I think is maybe a little bit unusual is typically there's something laid out, like parameters laid out around if things change by X% or some sort of understanding of what that means. Was that, do you know if that was discussed in this case? Because I think that it is very wide open in this case.
Yes, Counselor, so we, there were a few iterations of this and trying to have something that, again, was meaningful, but, not binding. And so, but in terms of, it was decided not to have specific metrics in there. So it's open. So there's not a trigger. I guess there wasn't a, agreement on, setting certain triggers where, because, so I think if you carry that forward, it's like, well, if there's a trigger, then there's an obligation to what? So I think what we're agreeing to is to a conversation and can look at the numbers at that point.
Okay. Thank you. And yeah, not necessarily a trigger, but just something to lay out what it was, what the intention was when we signed this agreement, so that 10 years down the road, someone can look at it and say, well, clearly the intent on both sides was to do X, Y, and Z here. But thank you.
Now I get to ask a few.
Okay.
In your exemption chart, year one is at 92.5. What year do you anticipate year one being?
So the project is expected to be done with construction in 2026, the first half of, early 2026. And so I'm always looking at Stephen on this because I always get, so it becomes, so that's fiscal 27. And so it would actually, the TIF would go into effect fiscal 28, which is July 1 of 2026. Correct? If we're done, go ahead, Stephen, thank you. I know this, but for some reason, I always end up going back to Stephen on it.
That's why he's here. Hi, Stephen.
Hi. Hi. So it depends when the construction is finished. We have a construction estimation building permit date of June 30th. So, for instance, if it was this past June 30th, we're in fiscal 24. So you can use that as your determination, I don't know, whatever year.
I asked the question because it's not like someone's building a house and it's going to have an occupancy permit.
Yeah.
They're going to be building out an entire site.
Yeah.
So they'll have different aspects, different permits open, but it's not like they're looking for someone to live there. So
Correct.
What is the trigger in order to, is it when the first boat ties up to the dock? I guess my question is, what triggers the start?
When the full construction of the site is completed.
Okay. So someone in the city's going to determine that?
Correct.
Building inspector's office?
Correct.
Or your office, or?
Both.
Okay. Fair enough. So sometime in that fiscal year?
Correct. So June 30th, if he's completed it in June 30th of 2026, then it will be for fiscal year 27.
Okay. Fair enough.
Does that make sense?
Yep. Don't leave while I got you here. That way I don't have to ask Tom, then Tom has to ask you. My second question is the baseline taxes, based on, it goes from 25 million to 30 million, and going from the chart that was in front of me, that was on the board, 737 million, or whatever the number was that was on the chart. Does that number escalate with the base, with the TIF, or is that held as a baseline throughout the TIF agreement?
So that can adjust based on the market. So
that percentage adjusted, that percentage of the original $30 million of value adjusts annually with the market.
Correct.
So when we reset the tax rate annually, that could go up to
Correct.
2.5%.
That could change, correct.
So that baseline will change, and then the TIF is on the additional value from construction throughout the 20-year term.
Correct.
So that base that is initially shown will increase incrementally over the term of the lease.
I can't say what the market will do, but it will change with the market.
Well, we hope it goes up. I defy you to find one person in this room that their property tax hasn't gone up. So, but yes, I would, that's so, but just because that's a question that's come up, and I'm just reiterating the answers that I've given out, is that baseline based on the 30 million of initial value is a base that is consistent through the term, and the TIF is on the increased value based on construction and improvements that are made to the property, the additional $270 million that Crowley's going to put into the site.
I believe that is how the TIF works.
Is that correct? And does Anna want to answer that?
Yes, and I think what Anna was noting is that, what we're talking about are projections, the actual numbers will be different because, as Stephen was saying, and as Councilor, as you were saying, that $30 million base value will increase in value over, assuming that there's positive growth in value, that in commercial industrial properties, that $30 million will increase in value, and that $757,000 for fiscal '25. That's even an estimate, a projection for what it'd be.
That's fair. Is that correct, Anna? Good. All right, I like that. I will say that for the record, I want to give you and your team, all the credit in the world for, when I was given the assignment by this group to act as mayor for 5 months, one of the first things we did, we sat down a couple times a month, and we always talked about this and this agreement, and anybody who sat in that room with me knew I wasn't happy with, first of all, the agreement that was initially signed, the memorandum of understanding, the idea of the 99 years. I beginning to wrap my head around it. It seems like but if you were in the room, you knew initially if the agreement is, if the CEC's agreement with Crowley is 25 years, why isn't our agreement with the CEC 25 years to mirror the agreement? We don't know what's going to happen 25 years from now, never mind 99 years from now. And that was explained to me. There's a bunch of outs in there, which I give you and your team tons of credit for. I will say some of the first agreements that I saw were more lopsided than this. Someone told me once when I looked at a TIF agreement, if the TIF agreement is if we're forgiving more property taxes than we're actually receiving over the length of the TIF, that's a bad deal. It's a better deal. I wish, I'm not going to lie, I'd be 100% honest if I didn't lie. I know there was a lot of good work. I wish the deal could be better for the city of Salem. And that's just my personal opinion. I think that I think a lot of hard work went into it, and there was a lot of entities involved, and it's a market that is very changing. And as you can see from just reading the articles in the Boston Globe about the various entities pulling out and paying penalties, when an entity pulls out of an agreement, it pays $60 million in penalties to be able to just sit there and be able to buy into the next round of bids. Makes you realize that the market has changed a lot, that if someone's willing to take a risk and not willing to risk all that money in a market that with supply chain issues and everything else that goes along with this evolving industry. But I want to thank you and your team and everyone for all their hard work. I know it wasn't easy, and I know there was a lot of back and forth with those discussions that we had, and those initial proposals we sent one way and they came back, and we kind of looked at each other and kind of smiled and said, okay, what's our counter? And I know it's been a back and forth, and I give you guys a lot of credit for coming up with an agreement that is actually favors us. I wish it could favor us more. But all that being said, I think you did a lot of good work. And, that's, I describe it as the mayor alluded to it, as big picture, little picture. I mean, I'm not going to, no one in this room is going to argue big picture. If they do, then so be it. I mean, you know, there is, you know, we're in the middle of, you know, a climate change, rising sea levels, weather, all of that. You know, this project represents a lot on the big picture. But when I put it in the perspective of me being a ward counselor, I put it in the perspective of the little picture.
Sure.
And the little picture is, how does Salem, on top of all the other benefits, how does Salem benefit? Yeah. And I look at it as, I wish we could benefit more, but I will say that Crowley has been a great partner over these last couple of years since they've been involved, and with all the meetings they attend to and everything they're trying to do relative to, we bring up an issue with regards to neighborhoods or whatever it is, and they do, you know, they want to make sure that that's part of the agreement and make sure that those issues are addressed. And they've been very forthcoming with me in my concerns and my neighbors' concerns. So I want to give them all the credit too. I think, you know, it's going to be interesting because, as I stated at the beginning, Mayor and your team and Crowley's team and CEC and everybody's come up with the agreement. Now it's our job to say, we look at how you crunch the numbers and say yes or no. So I think it's a good agreement. I wish it could have been better, but I'm really, I want to thank you for all your work.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All that being said, no one else? I'll open up to members of the public. No, well, there's two different orders. So I know that some of the members of the team that are just here for finance would leave because they're not here for the second part. So with that, with the matter specifically regarding to Council Order 409, which is the TIF, anyone would like to speak? Podium is yours. Polly?
So I think some of you are aware that I tried to spend a fair amount of time understanding this. I still have concerns, and there are 4 points that I want to make tonight, and I can repeat them if they need to be repeated to be able to be answered. What was the comparable industrial TIF, either in Massachusetts or the region, that was used as the benchmark to create this, if there was one? What was New Bedford's TIF, if there was one? And has there been an estimate of what the city's expenses and costs will be in terms of our side of having to manage and operate our side of this operation? Specifically, I'm concerned about our emergency services and our exposure on an entirely new industrial activity, which I think has a high side of exposure for the city in a very expensive way, particularly for our fire department and our harbor services. I would like to understand whether the city's tried to get a handle on that so we understand if we have to front-end load investments for services and capabilities and personnel, what those might have been. And the other thing is, because Crowley is a private company and has no obligation to provide their financials to the city or the public, how will we know whether or not this is successful, whether or not they're making enough money that in year 9 they won't be complaining and asking for a give back? How will we know, because they're not a public company and there will be no annual reports, where we will stand with this on a year-to-year basis?
I'm sorry, Polly, can you state your name and address for the record?
No, they don't have to. You don't have to. Do not have to.
Sorry, Polly Wilbert, 7 Cedar Street.
That's fine. Part of the SGC ruling is you no longer have to state your name and address for the record. If you wish to, you can, obviously, but yes. It's easy.
T.C. Riley Goggin, 9 Wisteria Street. I realize, councillors, you have a lot on your plate, but I'm not quite sure you understand all of the ingredients that they have placed there. I honestly feel that the idea of brand-new wind power is exciting, and that you want to be part of the future generation of what's going to be happening in Salem. But I believe that the document that was signed way back in December of 2022, before our ex-mayor left office, needs some explaining. And I also feel that there are some legal questions that is beyond what we have or what you have, and that you should be seeking out outside help on some of these legal ingredients that are now being served up to you. There's too much at stake right here for you to be pushed to give any type of vote this evening, and let alone, you need time to study, you need time for research. This has not been given to you. I would like to know when all of this was actually delivered to you. And no one seems to be giving us the answers. The public should have input into something like this. A 54 million TIF. And for people at home, it's a tax incentive financing. Is a lot of money. I realize that a lot of people are interested in this small little city of approximately 45,000 people. Why? Because there has to be money to be made. No one does it out of the goodness of their heart anymore. Times have changed. So what I'm saying to you, councilors, look at the ingredients on your plate. Tell them you need time to research it and to digest what you find out. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Sure. Come on up.
Hello, City of Salem. My name is Justin Antwitz. I'm a representative of the Carpenters Union, and I can't thank the City Council enough for their efforts, and then also speaking on behalf of labor and the deals that are worked out for PLAs and other things like that, the partnership of Crowley, the city. So when Mayor Pangala was talking about it, it's not just the private-public partnership, but also labor, and really appreciate everything that you've done. Some of our Salem residents are here with us, not all, but certainly some of them that were able to join us this evening. And this is just a really important project, and we really appreciate the work that you all are doing for all of us. I don't live in Salem, but I am within the 5-mile EJ zone, and my friends and neighbors are also very excited to be able to have opportunities to work in clean energy, and this is just a phenomenal project that we're excited for. Thank you.
Council. What's that? Not yet. Does anyone else who would like to speak? It's in the room. Is there anyone online? I do not see any hands up. Oh, I got one. Hold on. Where did Mike? Where did you go? Oh, he's in attendees. Hold on. Yeah, I got him. Yeah, I got him. I saw him and then he disappeared. Oh, is it? Yep. First one up is Mike McGee. Mike, I've allowed you to talk. Mike, are you there? Mike, I can't hear you. Sorry, Mike?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Now we got you. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you about that. Mike, do you have a statement?
Okay, great. You're a little, Bob, your mic is a little bit weak out here in Zoom land. I just thought I'd let you know that. Everybody else's is working fine. My comment follows up on what you were saying a little bit, Bob. It's got good points and bad points, but a particularly big problem I have with it is the 99-year lease for $1 a year. And I've heard references to, well, 99 years is typical for interstate agreements and so on and so forth. But this is not a standard. This is not a piece of property that's out in the back 40. This is not a building. This is 5 acres of some of the most and you've referred to it, some of the most valuable land. And I think that in the 818 document on page 4 from Tom Daniels, they came up and they pretty much said that it was initially the intent was to give the Port Authority ownership of the property. And indeed, back in the day, it was put onto House Bill 3545, which was dead on arrival and never moved forward. But to take the 5 acres that the city worked so hard to earn and give it to the state for $1 a year with its revenues and control, this is out beyond the completion of Crowley's good work. It's out beyond the completion of the South Coast Wind Project. It's out beyond the time period that we expect the floating wind to be. It's out beyond the decommissioning of the power plant. It's so far out beyond the headlights that the city is giving this property away. It's especially when it was the intent back in the spring, in March, I believe, to put this under the control of the Port Authority. So, Bob, I think you kind of mentioned the fact that, well, why didn't we just leave it for 20 years? Well, my question is, why don't we just make it for 2 years during construction and have the authorities put in the appropriate legislation that they intended to do and get it done and keep control of that property in the hands of the citizens of Salem and the Port Authority instead of giving it away? And that's my question. I just haven't seen anybody address that front on, and I'd like some answers to that if you could do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next hand up is Joshua. Joshua, you're muted. There you go.
Hi, Josh Engdahl, 4 Chandler Road.
Is that okay?
So, as a homeowner, property owner, business owner in the city, and also as a former merchant mariner, I thought it was important that I speak out in favor of approval of the TIF for this project today. As a citizen and business owner, I love the proposed tax revenue from the project, as well as the creation of up to 200 jobs. And these are maritime industry jobs, which I know firsthand, being a merchant mariner, are good, well-paying jobs from which our community will benefit. As a former merchant mariner, I'm familiar with Crowley. I have many former Mass Maritime Academy classmates that have worked for Crowley and continue to work for Crowley. And I know that they are a responsible company that will do right by the community. It's for projects like this that the state's designated port area classification exists, and also why the Jones Act was passed, and that is to preserve maritime commerce on our own shores. For me, this...
I didn't know I was going to have to talk. I thought it was only the tip.
For me, this is the perfect project, one that supports clean, renewable energy, and it's taking place in the perfect location. I would encourage the City Council to approve the TIF and give Crowley the financial leeway they need to succeed so that we may reap the benefits for many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Is there anyone else? Anyone else in the room? Anyone else in Zoom land? Seeing nobody? Does anybody from the team want to address any of the questions, or?
The least questions will be addressed in the next section.
The least of questions will be addressed in the next part? Okay. Fair enough. Council Varela.
Thank you, Chair McCarthy. I'd like to make a motion, if I may. I'd like to make a motion to refer this resolution to authorize a tax incentive agreement, finance agreement with Crowley Wind Services to the full council for a positive recommendation.
Council Varela moves to move
For
the
first
matter
passage, I'm sorry.
to the full council. with a positive recommendation?
If I can clarify, recommendation for first passage. Just passage, thank you.
Moves to move the matter with a positive recommendation to the full council for passage. Seconded by Councilor Prosnowski. Any further discussion? Seeing none. On the matter, to move the matter to the full council for passage with a positive recommendation, all those in favor? All those opposed? The matter carries. Second matter up is the matter of Council Order 410. Order to facilitate construction and operation of Salem's offshore wind marshalling port at 67 Derbyshire, whereas the City of Salem has collaborated with Crowley Wind Terminal LLC and the Massachusetts Clean Energy Council, CEC, in planning, permitting, and construction of Salem's offshore wind marshalling port, and whereas Crowley has purchased 42+ acres of land at Derby Street with the intent of to construct a marshalling port for the offshore wind industry that will be subdivided into two parcels, Lot 2A, which is 37 plus or minus acres, upland parcel, Lot 2B, which is a 5-acre parcel that extends from Derby Street down to the ferry terminal, extending alongside the waterfront in the southerly offshore subject property until it terminates at the end of the wharf in the adjacent berth, and whereas Crowley shall convey both parcels to the CEC, shall maintain ownerships of Lot 2A, and provide a lease to Crowley for both the construction and the marshalling port and the maintenance of said port for a period of 25 years, and the CEC shall convey the Lot 2B to the City of Salem, and in turn, the City of Salem, to facilitate the construction, operation, and long-term success of the marshalling port, shall lease 2B to the CEC for the purpose of offshore wind activities. Said lease shall ensure public access to the waterfront and allow maritime activities in Salem's port, and whereas pursuant to the City of Salem's Code of Ordinances, Chapter 2, Article 9, Division 4, the city planner and the director of public property have consulted with the city department heads and have determined that Lot 2B is to be underutilized. Now therefore be it ordered the City of Salem as follows. Upon successful completion of the 48 to lots 2A and 2B, shown in the draft subdivision entitled 67 Derby Street Plan of Land, prepared by Meridian Associates, 500 Cumming Street, Suite 5950, Beverly, Mass., dated May 2nd, 2023, attached hereto, Exhibit A, is hereby the conveyance of lots 2A and 2B to the CEC. The City of Salem shall accept the deed for Lot 2B from the CEC. Lot 2B, once deeded, is hereby declared surplus to the city's needs, and the mayor is hereby authorized to go through an intergovernmental agreement to lease Lot 2B to the CEC in the following conditions. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 conditions, which are maintaining public access to the waterfront, which includes but not limited to the providing pedestrian access to Blaine Street and the Salem Ferry Terminal, and allowing docking for the cruise ships and other maritime vessels, so long as said docking does not conflict with offshore wind activities, facilitate offshore wind activities occurring in Lot 2A when the marshalling port will be constructed, a lease term not to exceed 99 years, a lease payment of $1 per year. Termination of lease should Lot 2A and/or Lot 2B no longer be used for offshore wind purposes. Right of first refusal for the city's purchase of Lot 2A if the CEC seeks to sell it. Right to acquire the restrictions of Lot 2A, upland parcel if the CE seeks to sell it, maintaining the property and improvements thereon in good condition during the term of the lease, coordination and the collaboration of the city and the CEC for the development of new ferry terminal building and/or other port improvements. And I'm not reading that again. All that being said, we touched on it earlier. I will say that I think that we're going to bring either the mayor up or Tom. The intent always was for the 5 acres, which we've been pushing hard for years with the agreement that was signed with the Footprint Power. I'm happy to see that the 5 acres is in there. I'm happy to see the berth is in there. I'm not happy that the fact that we have to go through these other additional hurdles and the fact that the transition couldn't go right to the Port Authority. Unfortunately, the language was determined that the language wasn't proper when the language around the Port Authority was formed up, that the Port Authority only could take property within the Blaney Street property, which is kind of weird because we already had the Blaney Street property. It was more of, I think the intent always was to be in the DPA, the Deeport area, which would have been included this site. So I know there's been some work at the state level to amend that language, but for the purposes of right now, we have to go through the extra hoops of declaring it surplus, and then all of which were they just described in all those actions. So I'll let the mayor speak to it.
All right, thanks. I'll be brief. So again, Tom has a presentation where he'll kind of walk through this a little bit more in detail. But to summarize, again, the order that's before you carries out 3 real estate transactions or actions that are necessary for us to advance the project. First, it accepts the berth and the adjacent 5 acres of the property from Mass CEC. As you may recall, the city's community benefits agreement with Footprint called for an unspecified 3 to 5 acres of land to be granted to the city. That obligation's been inherited by the new property owners, and through negotiations, we've successfully secured that the total acreage is 5, as the councilor mentioned, and that it includes the deep water berth itself, which is the most valuable piece of the property. The second thing it does is it declares that property as surplus in order to lease it back to the CEC for offshore wind purposes, which is in fulfillment of the harbor plan and consistent with the DPA requirements. This will allow the CEC to then sublease the property in the remaining 37 acres, which they still own, to Crowley. And then finally, it authorizes the city to execute the lease to the CEC for the use of our 5 acres in the berth, for their use of the 5 acres in the berth. So these steps help us achieve some key policy goals, not to mention facilitating the successful redevelopment of the port. It keeps the underlying property entirely in public ownership. It ensures that only offshore wind uses will take place at the port. And it leverages our lease to ensure that a private party and not the city is maintaining and improving a city's asset, as the berth in the 5 acres. So I want to talk for a minute about the terms of the intended lease, the lease from the city to CEC for the 5 acres in the berth, since it's been a topic of some concern. As was mentioned, the terms for this lease started negotiation in 2022 by the previous administration, and they call for a 99-year lease for $1 per year. As Tom mentioned, this is not an uncommon arrangement for leases between public entities, which both the CEC and the city are, and it's identical to the terms of the CEC's lease with the New Bedford Redevelopment Authority for their property. Nevertheless, I understand there are concerns about those terms. I think it's important to weigh several considerations, including some terms that I want to give credit to Councilor McCarthy in his role as acting mayor for successfully negotiating into the proposed lease document. So first, we're receiving the land and the berth from the CEC for $0. Next, until this order is adopted by the council and the agreements are executed by me, we don't own or have any rights or control over the parcel. This is not property we currently own or have a use for. Third, Crowley and any future port operator will pay property taxes to the city based on the value of all 42 acres, including the city's parcel. This parcel is about 12% of the entire site. 12% of the total approximate taxes the city will collect over the first 25 years of operation is around $12.5 million. That's new revenue to the city received only because this parcel is being used for this project. Fourth, revenues the CEC collects from their lease with Crowley are placed into a fund prioritized for the Salem port. And Crowley carries additional responsibilities for maintaining the site, including the city's property. In other words, the city assets will be maintained and improved by entities other than the city at no expense to the city or our taxpayers. The value of that condition alone is substantial and can't be overstated. We've had a lot of conversations about thinking thoughtfully about how we invest in maintenance of our assets, and this is an opportunity to leverage the power of this lease to get private funds to invest in the maintenance and long-term care and upkeep and improvement of what is potentially an exceptionally valuable asset. Fifth, the lease contains a use limitation to offshore wind purposes only, and if the site is no longer being used for those purposes, the lease terminates, returning the berth and the acres adjacent to Blaney Street to the city's control. Sixth, the lease requires the port operators, not the city, to maintain the public access to the waterfront, including allowing for the docking of up to 6 large passenger vessels per year at our berth. Seventh, the city is provided with the right of first refusal to purchase the other 37 acres if the CEC ever seeks to sell it. Eighth, if we opt not to purchase the land, We instead have a right to purchase a use restriction to control what kind of activity takes place on the other 88% of a 42-acre parcel, all of which is land we don't own. Lastly, the CEC commits to collaborating with the city and the Harbor Port Authority on the design and construction of the new ferry terminal building and other port improvements on city property. So in summary, the cost to the city of approving these measures is that we lease property that we've never owned, we're receiving for free, and which will be maintained by a third party at their expense. The cost of not doing so is the inability of the project to advance, frankly, forestalling our ability to meet our clean energy goals as a community and a Commonwealth. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tom, who has some more slides.
Thank you, Mayor. Share this again. Okay, so to provide a little context, and some of this is repetitive, but the framework for these transactions was established last year in a memorandum of understanding. The parties to that are the city, Crowley, and Mass CEC, and this was executed by Mayor Driscoll. And it really defines the series of transactions that are needed to effectuate the project, and also laid out key terms in terms of the land, length of lease term, and the permitted uses. As Mayor Pangalo mentioned, under Acting Mayor McCarthy and Mayor Pangalo, there's been some refinement within the box that had been established. I want to pause for a minute and explain this shift from the Salem Harbor Port Authority to the City of Salem in terms of ownership of the berth and 5 acres. We had always envisioned that it would be the Port Authority that would own the berth and 5 acres. And what we discovered a year and a half ago is the enabling legislation for the Port Authority limits their geographic jurisdictional area to Blaney Street. So last year, there was legislation that advanced in both the House and Senate in the Economic Development Bill that would have, cleaned that up, corrected that, so that the Port Authority could actually work within the DPA. That Economic Development Bill, although it fell apart, not because of this project, but because of other issues last year. So the Healy-Driscoll administration earlier this year included the same language in a supplementary budget bill. The expectation was that that would have been acted upon by the legislature before June 30th, and that didn't happen either. And so, we're really, I think, clearly still are interested in the Port Authority being that entity, but the fact of the matter is this project needs to advance. And so our plan B is the process that's before you now. So the city obviously can operate throughout the full area of the city, doesn't have that geographic limitation that the Port Authority currently has. I think it's the intention, the desire to, the legislation that stall may never advance, but to pursue legislation that would be consistent with, I think, what the vision everybody had for the Port Authority in terms of their geographic area to operate in. So that's something that, separate from these discussion points, is something that we'll need to continue advancing. And so we are jumping through a couple hoops that have been described in the council order. Very briefly, accepting the deed in the berth from CEC, declaring it surplus for the purposes of offshore wind, and authoring the mayor to enter into the lease. I'm going to walk through the transaction here, just so folks can understand what's going on, and preface it with the site is currently privately owned. The goal of this at the end is that the site is publicly owned, but the private party, Crowley, is responsible for operating and maintaining it. So we get public ownership, but we have private party operating and maintaining the facility. So the yellow land here is the 42 acres that Crowley owns. And I'm just shifting this from the arrow over to a plan view. So Crowley is subdividing the property into 2 lots. That's on the planning board's agenda tomorrow, actually. So the berth and 5 acres, you can see the Salem Harbor is listed there, and so the berth is running horizontally, and then the 5 acres run parallel to Blaney Street and then jog over to India Street. So Crowley will be conveying both of these lots, the full 42 acres, to Mass CEC. Mass CEC will then turn around and convey the berth and the 5 acres to the city. These transactions are all occurring at the same time, is what's been envisioned. Mass CEC will continue to own the 37 acres. At the same time, we will be leasing, we'll be entering into a lease with Mass CEC for the berth and 5 acres. Mass CEC is going to be subleasing the berth and 5 acres to Crowley, and they will also be leasing their 37 acres to Crowley. So again, we're going from private ownership to public ownership, but the responsibility, the burdens are on Crowley. So Crowley will build the infrastructure on the full 42 acres. They're going to operate and maintain the port. And as I mentioned earlier, Crowley will be entering into leases with offshore wind developers such as Avangrid for terms, lease terms of, 2 to 3 years, or, potentially some differences from that. So as has been stated by the mayor, but just to go over it one more time, the key terms in the lease for our property, which will be called Lot 2B. So the use is limited to offshore wind purposes, and this is really important because this is the whole reason we're doing this, and it's the whole reason Mass CEC is involved here is for offshore wind. It's not to store superoos, it's not to have salt piles, it's not to have scrap metal operations. All of those things are permitted uses under a DPA. And what we're saying is this lease is limiting the uses to offshore wind purposes. And if something happens where that use is not happening anymore, the lease will terminate. We are maintaining our access to the waterfront for up to 6 large cruise vessels. Again, the berth is critical to the functionality of the whole site, so our property is enabling the full project on Lot 2A. As the mayor mentioned, we negotiated and have a right of first refusal on the 37 acres. So if in some eventuality where offshore wind is not happening, there's no, Mass CEC no longer has a rationale for being there and owning it, we have the right of first refusal. We would need to pay for it. Or alternatively, we have a right for a use restriction. So this would be something where we would acquire a right to limit some of the uses. The uses, again, DPA uses are marine industrial uses, and the really cool, well, this is a really cool one, but, it's tough, actually to find marine industrial uses that are consistent with DPAs that are also compatible with neighborhoods and do not require a lot of truck traffic on the road infrastructure. So if you envision, for instance, the use of the property for salt piles, the salt may come in over the water, but it's going to be going out by trucks, and that's not a use that we would want to be seeing, and that's the type of thing that we could acquire a use restriction in the future. The lease is for 99 years with a payment of $1 a year. The rent that CEC is charging Crowley, this is going to be held in a segregated account by CEC with it being prioritized for improvement in the Salem port. And this is something, CEC has learned, through their work. The New Bedford port has required additional investment, and they didn't have a reserve. So it was critical, essential to the Commonwealth through CEC that in their investment in this project, so there's $75 million from the state through CEC that's going into the project, that they also generate some revenue so they can build up a reserve that would be utilized in the future. So for instance, at the end of year 25 of the lease, maybe technology has changed, there needs to be a modification to some of the infrastructure, they've got some reserves in place. So they're acting prudently and responsibly, and that was very important to them. As we've noted, so again, the property and the improvements are the responsibility of Crowley to maintain and keep in good working condition. And lastly, we're all going to be collaborating. The city and Port Authority have the goal of developing a new ferry terminal building. There'll be other, port improvements in the future. We all, we're neighbors, and we all need to work together. So the steps on this, again, next Thursday is your council meeting to consider committee of the whole recommendation. We will be, all the parties are drafting documents. We will be finalizing the drafting process. The local permitting will be wrapping up. The real estate closings will occur. Crowley will have selected a contractor. They're going out on Friday with a bid to get proposals for contractors, and then construction will get underway. Again, the target being early 2026 when the port will be operational. And so I'm happy to take questions on this part as well. Yes?
Got to speak right in there. My question is to Beth. With these multiple real estate transactions that need to occur, do we need separate votes on each one, or is it just to approve the order to facilitate the construction that's in front of us?
So it's just to approve the ordinance in front of
Okay. So
Just
at
to
the council
repeat,
meetings, is it just going to be the same thing, just approve the order? Or is there going to be individual, is it going to be, because in the order, there's declare surplus, so there's not going to be individual orders that we're going to have to take up at the council. We're just going to approve this total order that encompasses, all encompassing. Okay, I just want to make sure that's, I've never seen it done this way, so I just want to, usually it's an order to declare surplus and all it, so just as long as we're all covered under it, that's fine. So as long as we move to approve council order number 410 as written, then we're good. Okay, fair enough. Council Masillo.
Thank you, Chair. Can you just go back to the city's uses for the berth? You had mentioned the cruise ships up to 6 and other things. What other things do you see the city using it for?
Yeah, no, so the deepwater berth really is going to be functioning as, for the operations of marshaling. So we've negotiated the ability to have larger vessels, cruise vessels come there, up to 6, because they need the deep water berth. Other cruise ships, don't need that and can continue to utilize Blaney Street. So if there were some other, I don't know any, I don't have a specific other use. If there were some need, I think, the harbor master, at times there's needs for, from port operations to assist with some other vessel that, the harbor master might be engaging on that. But not, there's not sort of another sort of industry use beyond the cruise vessel.
I will say that one of the other discussions has been the addition of the Dolphin, which is basically an apparatus that you use to tie up. So the smaller coastal cruiser ships, the port could be operating off the main berth, and we could bring in smaller coastal cruisers alongside if there's that Dolphin available in order to tie up and utilize the docks that we have. So there is that ability, but that's why this order specifically states the 6 larger ones, because the larger ones need to tie up to the main berth. Council Merkel. Are you all set, Councilor Massol? Councilor Merkel?
Thank you, Chair McCarthy, and I do want to thank everyone for all the work that's gone into this, and that personally I'm excited about the offshore wind industry being in Salem. I just want to make sure I have an understanding, to just clarify my own understanding, my own notes, that with this agreement, the 5 acres will now generate tax dollars for the city. Did I take those notes correctly?
Yes, thank you, Councilor. So the city's 5 acres, as well as the 37 acres that Mass CEC will own, although we're both tax-exempt entities, because Crowley is conducting commercial activities on the property, even though it's publicly owned, they are taxed as though it was privately owned. So our 5 acres, as well as the 37, generates tax revenue.
Yes, so those 5 acres do bring in revenue.
Yes.
So,
Yep.
thank you.
Exactly.
Appreciate that.
Yep.
Councilor Watson Felton, Councilor Dominguez.
Thank you, Chair McCarthy. Just 2 questions for me. Oop, sorry, this thing has a mind of its own. Sorry. So just to reiterate what I think I heard you say was that the closing transactions would also be simultaneous when you transact. So no opportunity for, no risk in there or opportunity for change between the closings.
Right, it's a simultaneous transaction so that everything gets done at one time.
Awesome. And then just to go back to, the resident who called in and had a question around the 99 years, I know that, we can sit here and say it's standard, but I personally, there's nothing I hate more than that's just always the way we've done it kind of answers. So could you talk a little bit more about why 99 years and not 50? If the lease is 25 and we want it to continue its use of offshore wind, 50. 60, why 99? Where does that come from?
So, Councilor, part of it is that it is, the typical standard is 99 years. It's providing a long-term horizon for Mass CEC. So remember, we have an ownership interest, but we're not investing in it, and we're not maintaining it. Those responsibilities fall to Mass CEC and Crowley. But after Crowley's lease, Mass CEC is still responsible for maintaining the asset. And so, excuse me, the property, I understand the concerns around the 99 years. So what we've looked at is, and sort of, in protecting the city's interest or Salem's interest, is looking at, as I noted, if it's not being used for offshore wind, the lease terminates and we have control over it. And that, in discussions as we were looking at, well, what are the concerns around the 99 years? It's saying it's a long time horizon. What happens? That what if really is coming down to the use piece. And so, we have protection, because if that use changes, then the deal is done. And, as I mentioned, the responsibility for the maintenance is falling to the private parties while, we're collecting revenue, as Councilor Merkel noted, off of the taxes.
Thank you. I just want to make sure everyone who's raised concerns is getting a sufficient answer, and not just this is just how we do it.
Sure.
For my part, and for the record, this is a slightly complicated set of transactions on its face, only in that there's just so many that have to go on, I think, for the public's understanding. But by and large, I think this is a really smart way of transacting and getting us all kind of moving forward and with fair mutual benefit. The real estate component of this deal is really strong, actually. I'm particularly supportive of the point that you just made, which is that if the use changes, right, that lease is terminated, that's a great protection for the city. I think in addition, I really love that, because I think one of the parts that can be confusing, or maybe people who are a little uncomfortable with it may feel like it's a $1 deal between two public entities, but then the public, the state benefits off a lease agreement with Crowley, right? And what does that number look like? And I think that the fact that this deal includes the requirement that that money is set aside for the use of that same space and for maintenance and if necessary is really a really smart component of this deal. So pretty tight all around. Well done, team. Thanks.
Thank you.
Council Dominguez.
Thank you, Chairman McCarthy. I had two questions right now in regard to construction and operation, and I asked similar question to New Bedford yesterday. It had to do with the construction, during construction. Are we using the same company that they use in New Bedford, or is it a different company working on? And my question in regard to that is because of the answer they gave us was that there is no noise during construction. There is no implication in the surrounding area, even though they are located differently than us. Can you reassure to the public that we're going to have a period of time during construction that the quality of life of the neighborhood will not be affected by any noise or any other implication during construction?
So I missed a little bit, but let me see if I'm answering on point. So during construction, there will be construction activity. It's a construction site as that's getting done, so there will be some inconveniences. This is where the planning board, in terms of the construction management plans, the dust controls, noise, light, those are all conditions that are fairly standard in planning board decisions around the construction. In terms of the operations, I think you were asking if we're going to be using the same if this board will use the same
construction company.
The same construction company?
Yeah.
So that's not known. So Crowley is going out for bids to select their contractor. I think there's a clear understanding and that Crowley has heard from many different sources, but neighborhood groups about making sure that there's tight controls during construction so that the disruptions to neighbors is minimized. And then during operations, that's been another point that's been discussed at the planning board meeting as well. It's, I think, for members of the public who weren't at the New Bedford site, I mean, it was very interesting to me where we saw this in full action. We saw components being moved and tower sections being, put together, stacked, and there was very little noise. It was great to see that, and it also seemed like a very, I drove around the perimeter, just a very tidy operation. There wasn't debris or dust or anything like that.
Yes, I was very impressed by the way they was conducting the construction. That's why I asked you. But I want to make sure that the general public understand that if that is the case, that we're going to have similar functionality. We're going to be out of any dysfunctional or any distraction during our live period here in Salem. Mm-hmm. My second question is in regard to the fishing industry. And I asked the same question to New Bedford, and they answered me that they had a fully communication channel with everyone involved. And my question to you, at this point, have you reached out to the fishing industry in regard to any new way of changing the industry in the surrounding area? Have you, at this point, have you already reached out to them or no?
Yeah, so indirectly. Recently it was announced this grant from Mass EEC to the Mass Hire, $1.2 million 3-year grant for pre-apprenticeship training. As part of the development of that grant, there were letters of interest and partnerships that were solicited. I think we had about 33 groups sign on. One of those was the Gloucester Fishermen's Wives Association, Angela Sanfilippo. So because there's an opportunity for fishing vessels, if they're not fishing, to perhaps play a role in this industry as well. So, so indirectly, yes. I think, you know, the other piece, perhaps related to what you're saying, was, you know, communication from the project through the harbor master about when vessels were coming and going. And, you know, I think that's the harbor master, and working with Crowley and the operator would be looking, you know, to have communication as well. I think that's, you know, was a consistent theme yesterday, is communication just keeps everyone informed about, you know, vessel movements, and so folks can adjust. Yeah.
Only because you fell off your porch.
I did fall off my porch.
I know.
Thanks, Chair. Sorry, one more question, and it's not directly related to the real estate deals, so apologies for going a little to the left here. But Ms. Wilbert asked an interesting question that I would love to hear your thoughts on, and maybe this might actually fall to the mayor to answer. But with the construction of this very unique use and the requirements, the structural requirements to be put in place in order for this to become exactly what it needs to be, is there any special training, additional burden, extra information that our emergency response folks need to know or have or understand in order to support this? You know, and in a dire catastrophic situation, is the city of Salem's emergency response infrastructure, do we have the ability to respond accordingly?
Yeah, so the emergency services they need, so from a site plan perspective, that's all being managed through the planning board. But in terms of specialized training or equipment, that's something that the harbor master is actually pulling together, you know, has been compiling that. It's similar to, and in the footprint project, when that was constructed, there was, my understanding, specialized training that was needed for the firefighters working in the enclosed spaces, and, you know, those, the costs for those were borne by the project, and that came through the community benefits agreement. So that's the type of consideration that we would have in something like that.
Thanks, and just a quick follow-up. I know sometimes in these large-scale industrial sites, companies actually have their own on-site, you know, maybe a smaller on-site set of trained folks to be immediate responders in the case of a dire security issue, or is that going to be the case in the functioning wind marshalling field?
So I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if any of our Crowley colleagues can comment on that, or, yeah. This is Joe St. Pierre.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. So with respect to on the site, the ship's crew they are the first responders, the firefighters, everything like that. They're required to coordinate with local fire they'll have drills and whatever. So there's that. And then Crowley will have staff on site to address, some matters. We'll certainly need some support at times from the city, but does that answer your question?
It absolutely does. Thanks.
Councilor Cohen, then Councilor Morcillo.
Thank you, Chair McCarthy. I want to follow up on what Mayor Pingalo said and show gratitude to the work that you did when you were acting mayor. You came in when this project was really in need of a lot of guidance, so I want to thank you for that and our long discussion about big picture, little picture today. A couple of things about the New Bedford visit. It was really educational from a perspective. We see these renderings of the towers standing vertically, and they really only stand vertically when they're in the assembly stage. So in general, they'll be horizontal. I agree that it was quieter than I expected. One of the things that really came up that's very important is that the site itself needs to support approximately 4,000 pounds per square foot. So the equipment that comes in when it's operational cannot possibly be transported on our streets. How could we have a 300-foot blade driving down Salem streets? But there's a big difference in the way that the New Bedford site was built versus this one. That site was a Superfund site. So there was a lot of money to clean up that site. That was federal money under the Superfund Act. A lot of the funding of cleaning up this property was done when Footprint came in. It was a requirement. I do want to follow up on something that Councilor Watson-Felt said about the term of the lease and the limiting of the use. And just putting my environmental climate mitigation hat on, and also for the PLA, I think it's really important that there's a level of stability in the length, and also other sites. There's so much competition with states that are really hustling to permit these kind of facilities in the Northeast, from New York, New Jersey, Virginia, that for the Clean Energy Center, which that's their thing, is to, promote clean energy, for them to, know that this is long-term, for the city too. So regardless of who future mayors or city councilors are, we know that this site is going to continue to be something that fulfills the need for offshore wind, which in some ways is the way to have the biggest quantity of clean electricity is through offshore wind. So I'm actually supportive of the terms. I know, just as a kind of aside, during the MROD votes, the CDC leases with the church for the, St. James and the one on Hawthorne, those are 99-year leases as well, just as kind of a perspective. I don't know if it's 99 is just what everyone comes up with, why it's not 87 or 103, but it just seems to be like a magic number. But I think it creates some kind of stability and consistency in the process. And, hopefully all these projects will be great from an economic driver standpoint. And so I think, compared to other sites which may not have this kind of limited use, having a limited use on this site, I think, is really important for the city. Thank you.
Councilor Massol.
Thank you, Chair. Since it was brought up, and I know it's kind of a left turn from the topic, but since we have so many principal people in the room here, I can't let this go by, because I'm big on communication. They did talk about a communication system, like an opt-in texting system that they were using in New Bedford, which I applaud. I didn't hear that it was from the harbor master, though. Is that true? I thought it was from the CEC. I thought it was from them, but
I'm not recalling exactly. I know that the harbor master was in the loop, but I don't know where it came from.
I just hesitate to put that on the city when they're the ones that are running the site, the CEC or Crowley. But I urge everyone to do that. I think that it's important for people using the harbor in Salem to know when barges are coming in and out. Could change their plans, and it's an opt-in. It's just text messages. It also lets people know what's going on at the site, which could bring a lot of people down to the wharf to sit on the wharf and watch things happen, that's what I'm planning to do, or to Winter Island. A little plug there for a little sightseeing. But communication's big, so since you guys are here, I suggest you get on that and figure out a way to do that. Thank you. And if there's no other comments, I'll make a motion.
I have a few.
Okay.
So I just have to look at, if I can, I'll look at Joe. Joe, who's the SPOC? Who's the single point of contact for this project? Who is going to be the person that's going to field the phone calls, answer the emails? Because I know this has come up in many discussions. Is it going to be you, or are you guys going to find some unwitting person who doesn't know what they're getting themselves into, or? It's going to be you. You're the SPOC, single point of contact, so we'll be looking we'll be looking to you, so good luck with that. Oh yeah, I had to blow it up. Good job, Joe. I knew it. John pushed it off on Joe. So, I mean, we have been working on this a long time. The real estate agreement is what it is in front of us, and we've had these discussions. I wholeheartedly hope that the city, in its infinite wisdom, at some point next year or whenever the state comes through and passes the legislation to expand the Port Authority's jurisdiction, that the city goes through a similar vote to put the control back where it belongs in the Port Authority. That's why the Port Authority we went through that whole process when we permitted, through the whole permitting for the power plant, to make sure that they help fund and create a Port Authority. With the Port Authority not having jurisdiction over this DPA, it doesn't make sense. So I would hope the city, in their infinite wisdom, in the near future, once these transactions go through, would then, if the state approves the legislation, would then move to somehow amend everything to go have it revert back to the Port Authority. My question is to Crowley. There was reference about the agreement that the former mayor signed in December. Part of that agreement was the 99-year lease. The other part of that was, in that agreement, it also referenced the fact that Crowley was entering into an agreement with the CEC for $2.50 a square foot for the property, including the 5 acres that we were turning over. I understand that agreement's been changed, and that's fine. I guess with all these real estate transactions, and the reason why we're receiving tax revenue is based on the fact that we are two public entities that are in the CEC's in a lease agreement with a private entity that is now making money off a public entity. What language is there in place with Crowley and the CEC if the Crowley breaks their lease agreement, and how will that affect the city? And does any of that language in their lease agreement have terms or conditions that will hold, in the short term, the city harmless if the CEC was to back out of their lease? Because I'm assuming if they try to terminate their lease prior to 25 years, there's some sort of penalty that they're going to be paying to the CEC. At what point does the city be held harmless, and with anticipation of, I know when the power plant site required special legislation through the state with the hold harmless agreement back with then Senator Berry and Representative Keenan. Oh my God, I'm showing my age. So I know, but in the short term, if such an agreement was to be if they were to terminate their agreement, short term, is there any provisions the CEC is going to be making payments to the city until some sort of either another port operator can be found, or if the CEC it's going to run the site themselves? At what point does the city, because now we're basing in good faith a lot of agreements tonight based on real estate transaction, which we're going to move forward with, and with a TIF agreement, but all of those are hinged on the fact that Crowley is going to be operating the port, and Crowley is entered into a lease agreement with the CEC. They're not entering into a lease agreement with the city. So if they were to terminate their lease agreement with the CEC, what provisions, if any, are included in there to make sure that the city is held harmless?
Sure. So we're not party to the CEC Crowley lease, so I'll just speak about the city CEC lease. So this is something, just to restate, the only reason we're getting tax revenue off of these tax-exempt parcels is that there's a private entity conducting business on them. So if Crowley were to leave, and, Mass CEC would be looking, theoretically they could operate it. They could also be looking to another party to operate the port, a private party. So, there is nothing, this is something that we explored with CEC. They don't have the authority, that sort of hold harmless to the city in terms of the tax revenue. They don't have that authority, nor do they have the funding for that. So, the model that you referenced, Councilor, back with Dominion, that's the type of legislation that we would, we've been talking about pursuing, so that if something were to happen where there is no private entity operating, but there's still offshore wind uses, it's still being used for offshore wind, but let's say CEC steps into operator, there's no private party, There's no private party, so, we're not having that entity, that taxpaying entity. So the solution would be through legislation is what we're looking at now.
Okay. Okay, I mean, just for me, Crowley's entering into a good faith lease agreement with the CEC. The CEC is now partnered with us. We've given over 5 acres and the berth for $1 a year for 99 years. And if Crowley were to leave, I'm not privy to their agreement, but I'm assuming there is some sort of language that if they were to terminate, leave early. So I would hope that the CEC, if they were receiving something upon early termination, would then turn around, irregardless of legislation, would try to hold the city in the short term harmless, because the last thing I would hate to have happen would be that this, I'm not picking on Crowley, I'm just using you guys as an example. If you guys were to leave and all of a sudden those payments were to stop, I mean, the last thing any of us would want to be in this room realizing that the funding source had stopped and now tax revenue that we were relying on was going to stop and was going to result in larger classroom sizes in the schools, not being able to fund certain whatever the funding was tied to, would help, that they would have to be somehow figured out a different alternative to fund them would be problematic at best for some other group of people that would be in this room years from now. So I'm just asking the question that if some language does exist between Crowley and CEC, that I would hope that we'd be pursuing some sort of language between CEC and ourselves, that God forbid that were to happen, that somehow short-term we were held harmless and long-term that we'd have to go back to the state. So, I mean, I'll leave it at that. Councilor Massol.
Thank you, Chair. So I agree. That's been something that's been bothering me. So is the intention to have some sort of like for lack of another term, a backup pilot with the state in the event that Crowley does break the lease, so that we don't have this cliff of real estate taxes?
Yeah, so Councilor, that's been talked about, but it requires legislation. It's nothing that...
I guess I'm asking what the city's intention is for the legislation. Are we working on that? Is it our intent? I know we have very little sway once it gets down there, but is it the intention to get this in place sooner rather than waiting until we need it? I guess that's my question.
Yeah, I think that's been our intention. Similar to the Port Authority, we don't want to wait. That legislation needs to advance, and I think, what we've discussed internally is looking to advance this type of hold harmless legislation.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Not waiting for the crisis.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else? Seeing none. Councilor Massilla.
I move that we return this order to the full council with a positive recommendation for approval.
Public comment?
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, the public was here left. I'm sorry. With that, is anyone else in the room? I'm sorry, before we entertain that motion, is anyone else in the room who would like to make comment about specifically the real estate transactions? I apologize for that. Anyone in the room? No? Let me click up the attendees. Anyone on the attendees would like to make comment on the real estate transactions? There's a few people in the attendees. Anyone? Anyone in the attendees? Seeing none. Going once, going twice. So there's no one in the participants, in the attendees, no one in the room. Councilor Massilla has a motion on the floor to send Council Order 410.
Second.
Back to the City Council for approval. Seconded by Councilor Varela. Any further discussion? Seeing none, on the matter of moving 410 to the full council for the positive recommendation, all's in favor? All's opposed? The matter carries. I'll entertain a motion. Councilor Dominguez.
Motion to adjourn.
Councilor Dominguez moves to adjourn. All's in favor? All those opposed, thank you so much, everybody. We stand adjourned.